Good morning, everybody. Hello. We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, the Tataviam, Katanamak, Serrano, Cahuilla, Payam-Quecham, Ahashaman, Ipai-Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement, authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And on behalf of the Center and the USC Shoah Foundation, I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to the annual Sara and Asa Shapiro Lecture. Welcome to those of you joining us on Zoom, and thank you to those of you who let us know about the Zoom link being wrong. Hopefully you've all joined us. Just a couple of notes about the protocols for the event. Following the lecture, we will have time for questions and discussions. We invite your questions in the room and also online by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. The lecture is being recorded, and that recording will be widely available afterwards. So if you missed part of it, don't worry. We're going to send it to you if you registered. We're completely delighted to have copies of Professor Dan Stone's book, on which he based this lecture, on sale here today, and he is willing to sign those if anyone is interested in that following the lecture. And yeah, I think those were the protocols. So now it is my pleasure to introduce the Director of Academic Programs at the USC Shoah Foundation, Dr. Jennifer Rogers.
Thank you, Martha. It's an honor to welcome you today to the 8th annual Sara and Asa Shapiro Scholar Lecture. I'm especially thankful to our partners, the wonderful team at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and particularly Professor Wolf Gruner and Dr. Martha Stroud. These two excellent scholars and colleagues contribute to the success of USC, as well as to the wider fields of Holocaust and genocide studies. Together, we are delighted to host this year's Shapiro Scholar in Residence, Professor Dan Stone, a renowned scholar of the Holocaust. In a recent conversation with Dan, he commented on how the work of eminent historian Sal Friedlander had captured his attention as a student and kept him from the process of revising for exams, and ultimately set him on the path of pursuing an academic career in Holocaust history. That spark lit a fire that burns brightly and intensely. The scope of Professor Stone's work is remarkable. In his 17 books and 100+ essays and articles, Professor Stone has explored the Holocaust over the longue durée and in its interdisciplinary complexity. To give you an amuse-bouche of his scholarship, he has written about everything from pre-war Jewish communities to the early camps, photography, death marches, the liberation of the camps, refugees and displaced persons, and memory. And if this weren't impressive enough, he has also tackled key issues of Holocaust historiography. Finally, and importantly, Dan has also been an ardent proponent of public history through his scholarship, as well as his work with exhibitions and documentary programming, among others. It would be difficult to discuss the entirety of Professor Stone's remarkable body of scholarship in this short introduction, so I'm going to instead focus on one thread that has been essential to Holocaust studies: the post-war reckoning with Nazism and its crimes. As most of us know, Nazi Germany unleashed an unprecedented humanitarian crisis even before the start of World War II. Under the cover of war, however, Nazi policies towards different communities, including Jews, Roma and Sinti, Slavs, LGBTQIA+, and persons with disabilities, among others, progressed and radicalized exponentially. Aware that Europe and those individuals, people in hiding, in the camps, and those forcibly taken to Germany for labor, who were caught in the crossfire of Nazism and its collaborators, would need relief and rehabilitation. The Allies began plans for reconstruction in the immediate weeks after Pearl Harbor. It was only as American and British troops liberated the camps, however, that the true horrors of what we now know as the Holocaust came to light. Despite their extensive wartime planning, the scale of destruction exposed fractures in rehabilitation programs, including material relief for displaced persons and the reunification of families torn asunder between 1933 and 1945. The calcification of Cold War borders exacerbated these tensions and further shaped distinct memory cultures of the war and post-war on either side of the Iron Curtain. Yet, even after the fall of the Soviet Union and the release of tens of millions of pages of Holocaust-era documents from not only Soviet archives, but those of the International Tracing Service, a topic that is close not only to Professor Stone's heart, but also to mine, we continue to find ourselves grappling with the histories and legacies of the Holocaust and its aftermath. Professor Stone's scholarship has given us a granular picture of how what he has conceived of as the quote-unquote process of liberation and post-war relief impacted the victims of Nazism on a personal level. Professor Stone has shown us the importance of archives as, to reinforce one of the key messages for the Shoah Foundation's 30th anniversary, Witnesses for the Future. Perhaps most importantly, he has also stood at the forefront of scholars who help us to understand the ways in which the history of the Holocaust is ever present, and indeed, as you will hear in a few minutes, unfinished. Across the globe today, including here in the United States, people are forgetting or do not learn about the history and legacies of the Holocaust, and an alarming number of persons and organizations openly distort these histories. The work of Dan Stone is thus all the more timely and necessary, and one of the many reasons we are delighted and honored to have him with us in Los Angeles today. This lecture is thanks to the Sara and Asa Shapiro Annual Holocaust Testimony Scholar and Lecture Fund, which was established by longtime USC Shoah Foundation Executive Committee and Board of Counselors member Mickey Shapiro, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. This fund enables one senior scholar to spend time in residence at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research and the USC Shoah Foundation to share their scholarship and strengthen the network of scholarship needed to keep these subjects alive and vital. This gift is one of the many ways that Mickey Shapiro continues to support the work of the Shoah Foundation and buttresses our commitment to Holocaust scholarship and education. Last year, we launched the Mickey Shapiro Endowed Chair in Holocaust Education Research here at the University of Southern California. This is a significant achievement for the university, and it will allow us to continue to innovate new ways to promote scholarship like Professor Stone's, as well as teach about the Holocaust to more audiences for generations to come. If you can't tell, we are deeply grateful for Mickey Shapiro for his continuous commitment to our mission and our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to Mickey Shapiro. So now to introduce today's lecturer and speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you very much, as always, Marta, but also Maya and Charlotte at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research for preparing, organizing, and also hosting this important event and others. And I just want to thank everybody who is present here and also on Zoom. Most of them are kind of missed the opportunity to watch the eclipse. And I think this is important in a way because we are here to talk about an historical event which actually eclipsed, because of its brutality and violence, so many other historical events. And for this reason, we are very thankful for our scholar to kind of bring and shed light into this historical event to kind of avoid this eclipse. So just a brief remark about the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at USC, which some of you might not know. It was founded in 2014 and has dedicated itself to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research on genocide and mass violence. We are promoting research with kind of unique Holocaust and genocide research resources and collections here at the University of Southern California, including the USC Shoah Foundation, our partners, Visual History Archive, but also other kind of substantial collections on Holocaust and genocide issues here at the USC libraries, which is the host of the room today. We try with the fostering of the research of our fellows and visiting scholars to transform the way we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, as well as the conditions and dimensions of resistance to it. The center manages and organizes a rich academic program, including annual international conferences. We bestow numerous fellowships and welcome visiting scholars. The center concentrates its efforts to kind of illuminate three important areas. One is resistance to genocide and mass violence. Another one is violence, emotions, and behavioral change. And the third one is digital genocide studies. It was already said, and I want to kind of reiterate this, that we are very thankful to Mickey Shapiro, who endowed this prestigious Sara and Asa Shapiro Scholar in Residence Fellowship in honor of his parents, and enables us to bring here luminaries in the field every year in the spring and kind of enlighten us about their approaches to Holocaust studies. Now a few words, some was already said by our partner Jennifer, so I can shorten a little bit this long list actually of accomplishments of Dan, because it's really difficult. I could have the whole lecture kind of presenting what he was able to do. So not only that he published dozens and dozens of books and scholarly articles, I think it's really important that some people publish a lot, but not every work is really influential. And we can actually say that most of his books had a serious impact in the field. And in the beginning, his work was focusing more, in my view, engaging with kind of historiography of other scholars, kind of engaging, discussing themes like, for example, the modernity, the connection of modernity and the Holocaust, or connections like colonialism and the Holocaust. So books which were, in my view, very influential are, for example, the Histories of the Holocaust, published in 2010, but also earlier books like History, Memory, and Mass Atrocity, published in 2006, or Constructing the Holocaust, a Study in Historiography, published in 2003. It was already mentioned that part of his work is also dedicated to the post-Holocaust history, and we now in the field think more that the Holocaust is actually has a larger kind of trajectory than ending in just 1945. We think kind of to extend this period way into, let's say, the 1940s, and one of us actually, and I like to mention this, the first kind of scholar we invited here for the Shapiro scholar was David Cesarani, and his influential book on the Holocaust actually ends in 1949. So I think there is a kind of a connection here between David Cesarani and Dan Stone. And So Dan Stone worked on books like The Liberation of Camps, which was already mentioned in 2015, and he received, for example, or was shortlisted for the 2016 Jewish Quarterly Wingate Prize, which also shows you that his impact was not just recognized by scholars, but also in the wider public. He is kind of a really prolific author, and just last year he published 2 books. One was The Fate Unknown, Tracing the Missing After the World War II, which was published by Oxford University Press, and the book he will talk about today. He is co-editor of many books, and I want to just mention also Hannah Arendt and the Uses of History, just to show his breadth, and Colonialism and Genocide. And I don't say this lightly. He has just in the making 5 books. This is what other people produce in their lifetime. Yeah? So in the next 2 years, he will publish the book Psychoanalysis, Holocaust Historiography and the Nazi Camps, Accounting for Survival, which will be published this June, right? And then he is kind of finishing a book which will be published with London Penguin, The Forgotten Holocaust, Romania's Genocide of the Jews in Occupied Ukraine. He has 3 volumes he co-edited coming out, and I only want to, because of the time passing, mention one is really important. He co-edited the volume 1 of the substantial new Cambridge history of the Holocaust, which is a 4-volume endeavor, which is several years in the making, and brings together dozens and dozens of kind of scholars from around the world with the latest kind of up-to-date research on this topic. He was, and this is also important, not just authoring, but he was also giving service to the field. He was the co-editor of the Journal of Genocide Research for quite a long time, 14 years, from 2005 to 2019, and co-editor of Patterns of Prejudice. And these editing kind of journals is really also important to support new scholarship and bring together kind of different fields of scholarship. He was the recipient of many awards and grants, and I want to mention that he is currently the director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, where he is, and I forgot to mention this actually in the beginning, where he is the professor of modern history and currently teaching, after he received his bachelor at Oxford and his master's also at Oxford, and where he lectured also for several years before moving on to Royal Holloway. As director of the Holocaust Research Center, he mounted not only a master's in Holocaust studies, but also together with the Holocaust Educational Fund at Northwestern, a summer institute, which is also kind of educating future scholars of the Holocaust by bringing together kind of graduate students and educating them in Holocaust studies. He is a mentor in graduate studies, for which he also received prizes. And then his public influence is huge. And this is really also worth mentioning. He was the member of the board of directors of the British Association of Holocaust Studies for 4 years. He is at the Scholarly Advisory Board at the Center for Jewish Studies at the Romanian University. He is a member of the organizing committee of one of the big international conferences in Holocaust studies, Beyond Camps and Forced Labor, which is on a semi-annual basis happening in London in January. And he is a member of the United Kingdom Government Advisory Group on Spoliation Matters, so kind of questions of restitution. He is a member of the Oversight Committee of the United Kingdom of the International Tracing Service Archive. And he was the chair of the advisory board, the academic advisory board for the redesigning of the Holocaust galleries at the Imperial War Museum in London. And unfortunately, I had not the possibilities to visit those, but I heard from several people that this is an amazing kind of new view, which is kind of displayed at the Imperial War Museum on the Holocaust. So, and lately he ventured into kind of curating exhibitions, several of them since 2018, and this is part of his cooperation of his institute together with the Wiener Library for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in London. So I could say way more, but I really don't want to steal the time. The only thing what I want to mention is that somehow that he is here today is also coming a little bit full circle, because we both met, I think the first time maybe in 2005 when the, at that time, European Network of Genocide Scholars organization was founded. And this organization later developed into the International Network of Genocide Studies, which we will host kind of for their biannual conference here at USC in June. So there is kind of, everything is coming full circle here. I thank you, Dan, for your scholarship, and we are delighted to have you here. I thank Mickey Shapiro again for this fellowship, and give him a warm hand for his
Thank you so much for the extraordinarily generous introductions. It's an enormous pleasure to be here in person in Los Angeles, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm following in the footsteps of some extremely eminent scholars, not least, as Wolf mentioned, my late colleague David Cesarani, who was the first Shapiro scholar in residence, but unfortunately died before he was able to come here. So I'm especially proud to be representing Royal Holloway, where David was also based on this occasion. I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to the Shoah Foundation here at USC for co-organizing my residency here. And I'd like to thank colleagues at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, PhD students, and those who've helped organize things, and particularly to Martha and Wolf for their extremely generous and kind hospitality. It's been a really wonderful stay here. And finally, of course, I'd like to add my thanks to Mickey Shapiro for making my visit to Los Angeles possible. So I'm going to talk about this book. I'll say a bit more about it and the way it was conceived and so on in due course. But I'd like to start by just reading a couple of quotations, a couple from the book and a couple drawn from elsewhere, which illustrate some of the themes that I'm going to speak about today. So the first comes from the diary of a young woman, a Yugoslav communist, Hannah Levy-Haas, who was a survivor of Belsen. And she wrote towards the end of the war about a boy whose body had been infested by fleas and who'd been rejected by his family. He couldn't kill the vermin that had settled on his body because he couldn't see them. They've burrowed deep into his skin and swarmed through his eyebrows. His chest is completely blackened by these fleas and their nests. We have never seen such a thing. We never imagined such a thing could occur. Everyone avoids him. His brothers and sister dread his presence, his fleas, his howling. The other night, he dragged his useless body from one bed to the other, begging people to make room for him. Everyone pushed him away in disgust. Painful story. His case is not unique. And then a second case, this comes actually from a story written by Isaiah Spiegel in the Łódź Ghetto. And if you haven't read his little collection, Ghetto Kingdom, I recommend it very strongly. It's one of the toughest books on the Holocaust that I've read. And although these are presented as fiction, they are quite clearly drawn from his experiences in the ghetto. And in one of his stories, Spiegel writes about a rabbi who at morning prayers appears to go mad after being mocked by German soldiers in the street. For a moment, Reb Bunem was paralyzed, overcome by shame and nausea. The blood rushed from his heart into his hands, which began to tremble. His eyes flashed an uncanny green flame. With a surge of preternatural strength, he suddenly turned to the praying Jews and started ripping the prayer books from their hands. The frightened Jews moved off to the side, while Reb Bunem continued tearing the psalm books from their grasp and casting imprecations on their heads. he shouted with the voice of one possessed, while in the darkness of the synagogue his beet-red face glowed with divine wrath. Jews, stop reciting psalms. God is on the side of our enemy. God is with the Germans. I beseech you, recite no more psalms. Our world is shrouded in darkness. And then a couple of other quotations that I'd like to just read out. In September 1943, a group of teenagers escaped from the Minsk ghetto and walked some 100 kilometers to a partisan camp. One of them, Zoya Oboz, was devastated to learn that they would probably be the last to attempt the journey. My acquaintance Sasha asked me where my sister was. I told him that I had planned to find out where I could go and then go back to take her with me. He told me, but we are going to the Naliboskaya Pushcha today, and today they are destroying the ghetto in Minsk. I cried so much, I did not know what to do, where to go. We then walked during the night and slept during the day. After several days, we arrived in the Pushcha. I had no idea what was going on around me. I felt like I had lost my mind. It dawned on me that I was all by myself. A year later, so in 1944, Andrei Raku, a Romanian from the village of Skayen in Bessarabia, confessed at his trial by the Soviets that he had participated in the robbing and killing of Jews. And this is what he said. During the autumn of 1941, I do not remember exactly what month, when the Romanians were driving a column of Jews through Skayen towards Ternova, some of them completely lost their strength and could not walk. In this case, after reaching the outskirts of Skayen, a Romanian officer and 2 soldiers started to shoot those who lagged behind. I approached them, and a Romanian soldier gave me the gun, and I myself killed 3 people. And afterwards, I gave to the Romanian officer 500 lei, so he would allow me to undress the dead. He allowed it, and I took the best coat from one Jew. When I brought home the coat and showed it to my wife, she started to scold me. I took that coat and sold it to the resident of Skayen, Rotaru Kostar, for 1,400 lei. I did not do anything else. And I start with those quotations because they illustrate several of the themes that I want to talk about in today's lecture. Issues of the shift eastwards in Holocaust studies, a shift towards thinking of beyond the notion of industrial genocide, issues of venality and theft and opportunism, the role played by local collaborationist forces, and so on. I'll come back to some of these topics. But before I do, I wanted to just say a word or two about the book itself, some of which has been hinted at by what Jennifer and Wolf said. The first thing is, I think, as everyone here knows, there's a large literature on the Holocaust. The historiography is kind of mountainous, right? Written in every language of Europe and beyond. Why do we need another one? I think I've been asked that more than once, and I think it's a perfectly fair question. And I think the point is, and this relates to the issue of being unfinished, I think that all history is contemporary history in the sense that the questions that we ask about the past are always shaped by our interests and concerns in the present. And on the one hand, there's an answer which is internal to the discipline of history itself, which is that in the last 10, 20 years, the historiography has mushroomed. There's a huge range of new studies, new methodologies. There's a greater diversity in approaches and topics, as well as a greater diversity in historians themselves. So if we look at who is writing the history of the Holocaust, it's very different today than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. And that in itself means that the questions that we ask are going to change. They also reflect fashions in the discipline. We've had the spatial turn, the forensic turn, the material turn, etc., etc. All of these things which have reshaped the ways in which Holocaust historiography is approached. And I think for a long time, Holocaust historiography was very conventional in its thinking, perhaps I think because of the nature of the topic, a fear of not being seen to be doing something trendy with a topic that's so terrible. But I think that has changed a great deal, and there's a greater acceptance of methodological diversity in the field itself, and a greater, therefore, diversity of people who are writing the history of the Holocaust. But it's also the case, and I think this hardly needs stressing today, that historians are always responding to things that go on in their world. I mean, it's no surprise that in the last 10 years, there's been a rush to appoint historians of China in English-speaking universities, etc. And in the last couple of years, obviously, we've seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin's claim to be denazifying Ukraine, this appeal to the memory of the Great Patriotic War in order to defend, in other words, to use a kind of rhetoric of anti-fascism in order to defend what is effectively a variety of contemporary Russian fascism in invading Ukraine. And in the light of what's happened in Israel, Gaza, it's quite clear that this topic remains unfinished. When you see on both sides, in some quarters, some Palestinians arguing that October the 7th was their Warsaw Ghetto uprising moment, and Israelis in the cabinet and elsewhere talking about fighting Nazis. And so this language, this vocabulary that comes from the Holocaust is very much still with us. It shapes the contemporary world. And in that sense, we have, I think, to keep rewriting this history. It's also the case, and this is a kind of paradox, that in history in general, I think, not just with respect to the Holocaust, that the subjects that are the most written about are the ones that generate more writing. So with all due respect to my colleagues who work on the subject, I'm sure there's a fascinating historiography on canal building in the 18th century, but the contemporary resonance of that historiography is perhaps a bit less pressing emotionally and politically and culturally than, let's say, the history of the Holocaust. And what we discover, and we discover this through archival research and through debates in the field, is that the more we investigate something, the more we learn that there is still to be investigated. And one of the things that's so extraordinary about the Third Reich is that in its 12 years of existence and a decade or so beforehand, the amount of material that it left behind, from ideological statements through to government documents and all sorts of other things, is truly gargantuan, an extraordinary amount of material that scholars are still discovering more and more. And Jennifer mentioned the International Tracing Service archive, which is something I'm happy to talk about at length if people want me to afterwards. And that archive contains 30 million documents. 30 million! And it's the largest such collection of material relating to Nazi persecution in the world, but it's by no means the only one, obviously, and there's a huge amount of material. So there's always, I think, a need to rethink the past in the light of the present, and that's something I've tried to do in this book, drawing on all the recent historiography, and also, I think, because in some of the other synthetic narratives of the Holocaust that have been published in the last decade or so, they're very scholarly, but I think quite tough for general readers. And this is a book that was meant to be for general readers, with apologies to my to expert colleagues in the field who are here. Hopefully they will also find something worthwhile in the book, but this is a book in which the scholarly architecture, the theoretical framework, the historiography are hidden under the surface. They are there, but they're not presented as such, like they would be in an academic text. And I wanted to write a book that took for granted the fact that the people who read it in the lay audience would already know something about the subject. And I think a lot of the books that are written that are trade books tend to treat the reader as a bit stupid. And the current trend towards the kind of kitsch type books, I won't mention any particular one, but if you add any epithet and follow it with "of Auschwitz," then you know the kind of books I'm talking about. Those books, they're not really serious engagements with the history of the Holocaust, and I wanted to here follow Saul Friedlander, and in one of his theoretical arguments, where he says that the historian should write a narrative of the Holocaust, but also interrupt it with his own analytical viewpoints and breaking the narrative so that it doesn't appear, and this is one of the this is the reality effect in historiography. It doesn't appear as though the text wrote itself. So to remind the reader that there is an author with a particular viewpoint. And this is not a kind of transparent window onto the past as it really was, that you're always being asked to think about a particular topic and reflect on it as it goes. So that's one aspect of it being unfinished. The second is one that has already been mentioned in the introductions, and that is that the Holocaust did not simply end in May 1945. And we've known this obviously for a long time. For the survivors, obviously the Holocaust did not simply end in May 1945. Most of them were ill. Many of them would remain ill for the rest of their lives. They then faced the challenge of being in DP camps, having to find ways to either be repatriated or resettled in a third country and rebuild their lives, with all sorts of consequences. But we also know that part of the history of the Holocaust is the huge number of Holocaust-related trials, scandals that have occurred over many decades. The question of, let's say, civil servants working for the West German government throughout the Cold War years, something that the East Germans like to point out with great glee at every opportunity, as if they weren't hiding their own Nazis, and so on, right up to the current day. So issues of restitution, Swiss gold, all sorts of ways in which Holocaust-related effects continue to shape the post-war period up until the present, show that the Holocaust in that sense is also unfinished. And that's something that I think I wanted to make very clear in the book. And also, of course, to say, following in the likes of Hilberg and other historians, to say there is no last word on this subject. There will only be a last word on the subject when it no longer is important to us. At some point in the distant future, when it just becomes perhaps a matter of scholarly interest, but no longer necessarily a matter of cultural interest in quite the same way as it is today. So, one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to try and respond to what I perceived to be some misperceptions about the Holocaust in the contemporary world. And these are things that, no matter, I'm not the first person to point most of these things out, but they seem to recur again and again in popular representations of the Holocaust, news reports about it, and so on. And the quotations that I started with illustrate three things in particular, which I'm going to talk briefly about. The first is that the Holocaust is not synonymous with camps. The second is that we're not just talking about Germans and Jews. And the third is that the Holocaust would not have looked quite the way it did were it not for a very large amount of collaboration across Europe. And those are themes, among others, that I talk about in the book, and I just want to briefly discuss some of them now. So first of all, to say the Holocaust is not synonymous with camps. This is quite a difficult one, because the reason, of course, why so many Jews were liberated in camps in Germany in 1945 was because they were the survivors of the death marches. So as the Red Army was approaching westwards, the Himmler issued an order that inmates of camps should not fall alive into enemy hands. And thus began the evacuations of the camps, known as the death marches. And Jews were sent, sometimes walking, occasionally, as in the case of Stutthof, by boat, and sometimes by train, across Europe to the camps that were still in existence in Germany proper. So Jews were liberated at Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Belsen, the largest being Belsen, where the British Army found 50,000 dying people and 10,000 corpses on the street. And so it's hardly surprising that people at the time understood these places as Holocaust camps, because in a sense they were. Belsen was not established as a death camp. It was functioning like one at the last stages of the war. So survivors who then said, oh, Belsen was the worst of the camps I'd been in, we should take that seriously, because, of course, somebody who arrived, let's say, from Gross-Rosen at Belsen in the last weeks of its existence saw a place in complete disarray, with no food supply, no water, and people dying on the camp streets every day in huge numbers. So, of course, They remembered it as the worst camp they'd seen. But the concentration camp system as such, from the establishment of Dachau in 1933 onwards, was not, these were not places that were established for the murder of Jews. These were places initially that were set up to incarcerate so-called political enemies of the Third Reich, then were used later on for rounding up so-called asocials and others, and then after the invasion of Poland, Polish political prisoners and so on. There were always Jews among them. And if you read early reports of the concentration camps, you see that the inmates talk about the fact that the Jews there had a harder deal than other inmates, but they were not brought there in the first instance because they were Jews. So the concentration camp system, by which I mean the system run by the SS's Inspectorate of Concentration Camps. There were many, many other sorts of camps as well. Wolf has written about many of them: forced labor camps, camps run by firms, city councils, etc. The Nazi prison system is something altogether different. But camps run by the IKL is what I'm talking about. And these didn't really intersect with the Holocaust, qua the murder of the Jews, until the late stages of the war, except for the fact that Nazi guards were trained at Dachau and female guards at Ravensbrück. Otherwise, there were two separate systems. The death camps, the pure death camps of the Operation Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, were not administered by the IKL, and in any case were not really camps. We talk about them as camps. Nobody was concentrated in them. There was a tiny number of so-called work Jews who were forced to live and work in the camps, carpenters and leather workers and so on, people there to serve the SS. Everybody else brought to those places was murdered on arrival. So these were not really camps at all in any meaningful sense. Where I think the camp system and the Holocaust intersect, and one of the reasons for there being the number of survivors that there were, is because of the subcamp system that was set up. Wolf has shown in his book on forced labor that there were always Jews engaged in forced labor in one way or another throughout the duration of the Third Reich. But towards the end of the war, when the Nazi regime was in a desperate economic position, the Nazi leadership decided to attenuate to some extent its own ideology and to accept the fact that Jews were needed as slave laborers and would work on the territory of the Reich, which had previously been declared Judenrein, or Jew-free. And so from 1943, but particularly in 1944 onwards, you see this huge expansion of the sub-camp system. And these were small camps, mostly in industry, aviation, ammunition, but some in agriculture, working outside, road building, and so on, that were attached to the main camps. And I mention this because this is still a subject that has not, I think, been properly incorporated into the historiography of the Third Reich. There were over 1,000 of these subcamps attached to the about 13 or 14 main camps by the start of 1945. There were, according to the SS's own figures, about 714,000 registered concentration camp inmates at that point, January 1945. And there were more of them were working in subcamps than were living in the main camps at that point in time. And yet the names of these places, with a few exceptions, have almost no resonance, I think, in the English-speaking world. If you read testimonies or listen to the interviews here at the VHA, you come across these names. But in general, people might be familiar with Auschwitz, but the Auschwitz subcamps of Blechhammer, Eintrachthütte, Janina Gruber, Neudax, Chebinia, etc. These are places that have been completely forgotten. Some of them were quite large. Blechhammer held about 4,000 inmates, I think was probably one of the largest of the Auschwitz subcamps. But each of the main camps had these camps attached to them. I think for me the most interesting example is Gross-Rosen, because Gross-Rosen itself, I think in the English-speaking world, is the main camp that is least well known, despite the fact that in January 1945 it held something like 11% of the total number of concentration camp inmates. A very large proportion of them women, mostly Hungarian women. This is after the point at which the Hungarian Jews had been deported in the spring of 1944, and about a third of them were immediately shipped out of Auschwitz to go and work in slave labor subcamps. And so camps like Christianstadt, for example, which is today in a remote corner of Western Poland. A small camp for women, mostly Hungarian, but also some Poles and others, working with dangerous chemicals to produce munitions for the Third Reich. Very interesting place. Again, almost nothing is known about it. And the same is true of many of the other camps. Oskar Schindler's factory was also one of the sub-camps of Gross Rosen. So there's a huge amount of research still to be done on these camps, I think. And this is, I think, where the camp system and the Holocaust intersect. And one of the reasons why, obviously mostly young people, were able to survive the rigors of the death marches and still to be alive in May 1945 was because those who were working in those sub-camps were slightly better fed and slightly better accommodated than they would have been had they been sent straight to Auschwitz or Gross Rosen main camp. And so these were people who were just about fit enough to be able to survive the war. So in a bizarre sort of way, a system that was designed to make use of these people and then allow them to die through work saved their lives purely by chance. I mean, had the camps been liberated a couple of weeks later, the number of people dead obviously would have been far higher. The second thing I want to talk about is that the Holocaust is not simply synonymous with Germans and Jews. I mean, this is not a problem in some parts of the world, but I think in the English-speaking world, certainly in the UK, and I think here too, there is a tendency to focus on Germans and German speakers and German Jews. It's perfectly understandable. The Third Reich was a German regime. The history of its first years is obviously about Germany, and the persecution of the Jews obviously therefore has to do with the persecution of the German Jews. But after the start of the war, the picture becomes very different and much more complicated. The German Jews, half of the German Jews left the country. Some again were then caught and murdered, those who'd left for the Netherlands and France and other parts of Western Europe. But among the victims of the Holocaust, the German Jews probably make up no more than about 4 or 5%. The vast majority of Jews killed in the Holocaust were Eastern European, in the region that was previously the Pale of Settlement. So the Western Soviet Union, the Eastern European borderlands, going from, I suppose, the Cold War border from Stettin in the north down to Odessa in the south. Along that corridor is where the vast majority of the victims of the Holocaust came from. Fully half of the victims of the Holocaust were Polish. More Jews were killed from the city of Warsaw than the whole of Western Europe, for example. And the fact is that despite the efforts of the USHMM and Yad Vashem to create databases of names, there are probably still about 1 million victims of the Holocaust whose names we don't even know. And I think there we're talking about communities in Eastern Europe that were completely wiped out. And not only Jewish communities. If you look at what the Nazis did in Belarus in general, and the absolute scorched earth policy and destruction of that country, which also helps to understand something about post-war Belarusian history up to the present, it tells you something about how those communities were totally devastated. And obviously one of the reasons why we focus on the German Jews is because of sources. You can't, when I was writing my book about the ITS, this was a big problem, that there's inherent into that project was what social scientists talk about as survivorship bias. That's to say, what sources you have. But it has a double meaning, obviously, in this context, because there's a survivor bias. There's a lot of source material that comes from survivors and interviews with survivors. But survival was not the majority experience of the Holocaust. And therefore, you have to think about how to write that history, knowing that it's kind of skewed by the fact that even the people that you're dealing with are not representative of the phenomenon that you're trying to describe. This is what Primo Levi talked about when he talked about the drowned and the saved, that those who'd returned or those who were drowned, as he put it, the murdered, those were the best, and that everyone else, the tiny minority who were saved, offer a kind of skewed perspective on things, and so we have to take that into account. The third thing I wanted to talk about is the issue of collaboration. And I think since the end of the Cold War, we've seen one of the ways in which the historiography has changed so much is through access to sources in Eastern Europe that were previously inaccessible. Those in Russia obviously have become inaccessible again. But so it's just as well, I suppose, that USHMM went and swept everything up in the way that it did. It's also kind of more convenient to sit in Washington and use the archives than it is to sit in dusty and cold archives in Romania or Moldova or whatever. So for lots of reasons, it's good that many of these archives have been copied. But what we saw also in that period, as the former Eastern European communist countries started to bid to join the European Union, one of the things that they did was to produce these reports, these commissions that were instituted into the country's role during the Holocaust. Not only that, there were also commissions of inquiry into the history of communism in those countries and so on. Tony Judd described these Holocaust-related commissions as the former communist countries' entry ticket to the EU. In other words, that engaging with Holocaust memory was a way of showing that these countries were ready for the kind of polite thinking about memory. They weren't going to bang on too much about the horrors of communism, and they were going to accept the fact that Holocaust memory was central to how the European Union thinks about itself. And one of the things that these commissions discovered, of course, and one of the reasons why they were so controversial is that they uncovered the extent of collaboration, local collaboration in every country of Europe that produced one of these reports. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't collaboration in France or Italy or Norway or elsewhere. Of course there was, but that's been dealt with separately. I think what I wanted to show in the book was to think about, and this is also a kind of present-driven question, to think about why some of the issues currently plaguing European politics, the rise of the far right, populism, and so on, are somehow related not only to very current day concerns, but also are a kind of revival of memory from the war. That if you think about the consensus after the war in France, in Italy, the anti-fascist consensus where everyone was in the resistance, nobody was a fascist, etc. Those arguments have been blown apart in Western Europe for at least 30 or 40 years. But in Eastern Europe, they've taken, of course, because one couldn't discuss this under communism. Now it's, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a rise of fascist memory in a way that shows that it hadn't been discussed and worked through in the immediate post-war years. So I wanted to try and engage with the historical facts of this, and then to think what is it about what happened in the past that helps to explain what's going on in the present. And what you see is that I didn't want to overstate this. What you see is that in the case of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust, the vast majority of them were killed by Germans, by which I mean Germans in the sense of the Third Reich, Germans and Austrians and Volksdeutsche and so on. But without the assistance of local auxiliary forces and the state across Europe, the number of Jews killed would, I think, have been far smaller, and at least it would have been far more difficult for the Germans to put their hand on Jewish populations everywhere they went. We're familiar with the image of the French police rounding up Jews to take them to the Veldiv and then to Dornsife and then on to Auschwitz. Norwegian policemen rounded up the Jews of Norway, drove them to Oslo harbour, where they were shipped to Germany and then sent by rail to Auschwitz. And since the end of the Cold War, we also see in greater detail the role played by the Hungarian police and gendarmerie in rounding up Jews. Eichmann in Hungary had a Sonderkommando, a special squad of a couple of hundred men. They, on their own, were not responsible for rounding up 437,000 Hungarian Jews. They relied on local police forces for that to happen. The case of Jasenovac in Croatia the only death camp not run by the Nazis in Europe is, I think, something that still requires much more investigation. The Risiera di San Saba, the death camp, the only death camp on Italian soil, established in the Salo Republic after 1943. Another example of a place run by the Germans, but of course on the basis of local Italian collaboration that had been in place since the beginning of the fascist regime. And the case that interested me most, and Wolf mentioned the book that I'm planning to write on, is the case of Romania, because what you see in most of Europe are either auxiliary forces in occupied countries, such as Ukraine, who threw their lot in with the Germans. In the case of the OUN, in the hope of acquiring a Ukrainian state, misplaced hope under German hegemony. Or you see so-called puppet regimes, so these quasi-independent states like Slovakia or Croatia. I think historians have been too ready to call them puppet states. They had actually quite a lot of room for maneuver. Nevertheless, these were places that were either under German occupation or in the German orbit. Romania is different because Romania is the sole case of an independent sovereign state allied to Nazi Germany, but not occupied by it, that carried out, I suppose, what we might call a Holocaust of its own. So after the Third Reich, Romania is the European country responsible for the murder of the most Jews in the Holocaust. So the Romanians under Ion Antonescu occupied a slice of Ukraine between the Dniester and the Bug rivers called Transnistria, not to be confused with the breakaway region of today's Moldova, also called Transnistria. It's slightly complicated. But they occupied this region, which included Odessa, the local Jews there, as well as Jews deported from northern Bukovina and Bessarabia, regions that had been acquired by Romania after World War I, and which were part of the regions that formed Greater Romania. They were deported to Transnistria, and the Romanian regime is reckoned to be responsible for the murder of between 300 and 350,000 Jews there. So a huge number, and far more than were killed, let's say, by the Croatians or other countries. Most other collaborationist regimes sent the Jews to the Germans to be killed. The Romanians did something different. However, the Romanian case is also unusual in that although the Romanians introduced a whole slew of legislation, so-called Romanianization legislation, a bit like the Aryanization measures in Nazi Germany, and it introduced anti-Semitic legislation akin to the Nuremberg laws. Nevertheless, there wasn't a plan to murder Jews in Bucharest. The plan was to deport the Jews to Transnistria and then shove them over the border into German-occupied Ukraine, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And that plan didn't materialize precisely because the Germans occupying that region of Ukraine refused to take them. And so the Romanians basically ended up dumping the Jews in former collective farms, agricultural settlements, places that have also come to be known as camps or ghettos, but which in most places were not. They didn't look like Dachau, let's say. These were places where Jews were dumped in the open and said, just get on with it. But what was also different was that they were able to organize themselves. They had local committees and so on. They were able, after a certain period, to receive help and aid from the Jews in Romania proper, in the Regat, the old kingdom of Romania. And what's also interesting is that after the summer of 1942, that the Romanian regime changed its mind and decided that they could see which way the wind was blowing in the war, decided to deport no more Jews. And so the Jews of the Regat, the Jews of the Banat, and southern Transylvania were not deported and murdered, so that by the time the Red Army arrived in Romania in the spring of 1944, Romania had the largest surviving Jewish community in Europe. And thus was born the post-war myth of Antonescu and his cabinet, particularly Radu Leca, who was the Minister for Jewish Affairs, as saviors of Jews. And there is still this myth in Romania of Antonescu as a savior of the Jews. It's partly true, but it also partly includes the fact that he had also murdered over 300,000 Jews and was quite rightly executed as a war criminal at the end of the war. So the issue of collaboration, I think, is one I've tried to investigate in the book, and to show that it's to try and put it in its proper perspective. Not to say that more Jews were murdered by non-Germans than was actually the case, but just to say that if we're trying to understand the ways in which fascist memory, and that's a subject that hasn't been investigated in great detail, the ways in which fascist memory has come to inform contemporary debates across Europe, that this issue of collaboration might have something to do with it. How am I doing for time? A couple of minutes? I think that the book begins with a sort of history of ideas approach. One of the things that didn't get said in the introduction is, I mean, I think of myself really as a historian of ideas, or intellectual historian, I think would be the phrase in the US. And so the first couple of chapters are about ideology and about the melange of ideas that fed into Nazi ideology. And that's because I wanted to argue in the book that I'm sure people here are familiar with the intentionalist, functionalist debate and so on. It doesn't really exist in quite the same way as it used to, this debate, but it still recurs in various ways. And I wanted to say that the historiography now shows us that the functionalists were absolutely correct, in a sense, that the ways in which the Nazi regime drove forward the Holocaust was not planned out in advance. There wasn't a plan in 1920 or in 1925 or even in 1939 to murder the Jews. The genocide unfolded in an ad hoc, reactive sort of way. It was very much shaped by military circumstances, which population groups the Nazis could put their hands on at any one time, which groups they had to kind of wait on because of their allies' capricious decision-making, and so on. Nevertheless, if you follow the functionalist argument to its conclusion, you fail to understand why the Nazis targeted the Jews in the first place. It's all very well to say, yes, this was an ad hoc process and it wasn't really planned out properly, but still, why the Jews? And so you have, I think, to return to some version of Nazi ideology, not a simplistic intentionalist argument that says Hitler always wanted to murder the Jews, but rather what I talk about in the book as an incipient genocidal fantasy, so that from the first Nazi Party program of 1920 onwards, you can see that what Alon Confino talks about of the idea of a world without Jews is something that is there in the Nazi imagination. There isn't a plan, but there is a fantasy. And the Nazis gradually realize this fantasy. And I use that term very deliberately because there is, I think, in Nazi ideology, a curious mix of, on the one hand, a sort of quasi-scientific argument about race and blood, the argument derived from Darwin and so on, arguments about the survival of the fittest. And there is, on the other hand, what I talk about as a kind of mystical anti-Semitism. And again, I mean, this has been noticed before. I cite in the book the words of Eric Fergelin, a philosopher from the 1930s, who wrote a book on Nazi race thinking, in which he describes Nazi ideology as a system of scientific superstition. I think that's absolutely brilliant, that he puts his hands on this idea of a system that claims to be cool, rational, rooted in anthropology and genetics and biology and so on, but which is actually based on a given, an assumption, first of all, A, that race exists, secondly, that the Aryan race is deserving of triumphing in this battle of good and evil, and thirdly, that this battle of good and evil, this Aryan versus non-Aryan constellation, is what drives world history. And I don't want to overdo it. This is not a kind of Goldhagen argument that says all German Jews had absorbed anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. I'm actually what I say in the book is that what's important is not that everybody believed this. The majority of people, minor perpetrators who were involved for all sorts of reasons: venality, peer pressure, careerism, opportunism, and so on. What mattered was that a very small stratum of the Nazi leadership believed in this. And for those people, they genuinely did believe in it. And here, the argument is not about, I think, Darwinism or biological ethics and so on. Here, the argument is more of a paranoid, mystical conspiracy theory. The Jews, not Jews as Untermenschen, as eugenically inferior and so on, but Jews as the people who control the world. The Jews as the controllers of international finance, capitalism, but also international communism. The Jews as those who run London, Moscow, Washington, etc. And this, I think, this fear of the Jew is evident everywhere you look. Jeffrey Herf, in his book, The Jewish Enemy, shows that the propaganda against the Jews becomes more shrill towards the end of the war, when most of the Jews of Europe have been murdered. But the Nazi regime is continuing to remind people that if they lose the war, the revenge carried out on them by the international Jew will be terrible. And that, I think, is indicative of the fact that the leadership stratum really believe in this stuff. And that's one thing that I think I wanted to try and get across very clearly. So it's not a simplistic intentionalist argument that says the Nazis always wanted to kill the Jews, but it is an argument that says, unless we understand why the Nazis were fixated on the Jews, we can't understand why they devoted their resources to this program in any case. I think that's probably a good place to finish. I did a podcast recently where the interviewer asked me at the end, rather unexpectedly, if I had a couple of messages, for people in the present, what would they be? And I hate that kind of stuff because I'm a historian, I'm not a soothsayer. So I said, well, on the one hand, we should take seriously the pronouncements of politicians who we think are crazy. And secondly, I said we should go easy on the austerity politics, because I think that the history of the Holocaust, as has been mentioned, is important. It remains important. But on its own, teaching about the history of the Holocaust won't change anything unless we also think about the broader social circumstances in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll open it up for questions. And I just want to remind the people on Zoom to ask questions using the Q&A feature. And we have about half an hour for questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. My colleague Maya will be reading the ones online. And are you okay with just calling people?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. So my question here is sort of, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how to situate as well other groups that were targeted for genocide and violence, specifically Sinti and Roma and the disabled, and how they kind of come into the conversation and interrupt/add to the narrative.
Good, thank you. It's an important question. The book, I mentioned this in passing in the book, but the book is devoted to the Nazi genocide of the Jews, because I think, we can all debate this ad nauseam, but I use the term Holocaust to refer to the genocide of the Jews and not to the persecution of other groups carried out by the Nazis, not because I think those groups of people are not worthy of being discussed. I think that's always the risk when you do that. People say, oh, he doesn't care about the Roma and Sinti and so on. But because I think that what I've described is a reflection of Nazi ideology, in the sense that the Nazis targeted many groups, and the Roma were, along with the Jews, victims of genocide. I think there's no doubt about that. But the Nazi obsession with the Jews sets their ideological position on the Jews apart from the way in which they think about other groups. That's the way I see it. So I think, although I'm reluctant to argue, for example, that eugenics was crucial for understanding the Holocaust, it is crucial, I think, for understanding the sterilization program, the murder of the disabled, the euthanasia program, and so on. It's also more than relevant for understanding the Nazi persecution of the Roma. For those groups are groups that were considered to be eugenically, i.e. biologically threatening to the purity of the Aryan race, unesthetic, dangerous, unappealing, basically kind of injurious to the notion of what a pure, homogeneous people should look like. And so they are removed as inferior. Whereas I think that the Nazi position on the Jews is not simply that you can, of course, find references in film, in speeches, in all sorts of ideological contexts to Jews as inferior, but you also find this notion of the Jew as a threat, as somehow competing with and a danger to the existence of the German people. And that, I think, is different. So that's what I've tried to focus on here. I hope people won't misread the book as meaning that I think it's not important to write about other groups persecuted. But I think if you use the term, or just talk about the Jews and other groups in one context, it kind of does disservice to those other groups, actually, that it doesn't really help you understand why those people were persecuted and on what grounds. So I hope that's a sort of answer to the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions for clarification. In the very beginning, you said kind of in the trajectory of Holocaust studies, there was this development towards diversity. And I want you to kind of elaborate a little bit more what you mean by diversity of scholars, but also diversity of methodologies.
Yes.
This would be illuminating. And the other thing for clarification, when you introduced the theme of the next book, which was Romania, you talked about that on the one hand, that Antonescu was kind of responsible for murdering 350,000 Jews, but you described it more as kind of dumping them into sites.
Okay.
Yeah. But you didn't actually tell us why, how and why.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I'll deal with that one first, whilst I think about it. So first of all, large numbers of Jews died because they were dumped in the freezing cold of winter 1941 in Transnistria and had no resources, no shelter, no food, and so on. And in some of the camps, Vapniarka and so on, these are places where Jews were given animal fodder to eat, which then made them ill, and they then died from those causes as well. But the large numbers of people killed there were largely killed in some of the biggest massacres that took place in the context of the Holocaust. And so this is one reason why I think I want to write more about this in the forthcoming book, because when I've spoken about this elsewhere, people are kind of shocked. These are, again, like some of the subcamps, these are names of places that have no resonance in the English-speaking world. So Domanovka, Akhmechetka, Vapniarka, Pechiora, and the largest massacre of all in Bogdanovka, which is a small village on the northern part of Transnistria on the Bug River, over the winter from Christmas 1941 to the first couple of weeks of 1942, something like 48,000 Jews were shot there. So more Jews than were murdered at Babi Yar, more than were killed at Operation Harvest Festival, and so on. And they were killed under Romanian control, but with the huge assistance of local Volksdeutsche. And to some extent with the Einsatzgruppe D. So there was German participation in the killings, but they were under the auspices of the Romanian military at the time. And when this book was published, some of the comments in Romania were quite interesting. There were some of the online responses. There was one that said, don't be ridiculous, the Romanian army didn't even have 48,000 bullets, etc. So playing into these notions of Romanian primitiveness and so on. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The Romanian army had lots of bullets and used them willingly. So there were these huge massacres, which largely accounted for the murder of people. And the same was true in Odessa. So although, how many Jews were there in Odessa before the war? Like a couple of 100,000. Something like half of them were evacuated by when the Red Army withdrew. But that still left about 100,000. And they were also shot and murdered over spaces of time. The first point is really interesting. I mean, you only have to look at the PhD students in the room and see what people are working on to see that by diversity I mean, first of all, that the majority of historians are not white men. Although some of us are, but there's a huge diversity. There are far more female scholars than there were 20 or 30 years ago, and subjects, if you think about the debates about women and the Holocaust from the 1980s and 90s, there are echoes of those debates now being played out in debates about queer history, history of sexuality, and so on. But I think not with the same virulence as the debates in the 1990s about women. I think there's a greater acceptance of the fact that methodologies and approaches that are being applied in history in general can also be applied in the context of the Holocaust. That in the debates about women and the Holocaust, there were scholars who said, "Oh, this is simply pushing a feminist agenda, and it's not appropriate in this context." I haven't really heard that said in quite the same way with respect to queer studies. So I think that's changing. But there's a greater willingness amongst historians, I think, to draw on ideas coming from cultural geography, from archaeology, from literary theory, from law, all sorts of other subjects. So, some of the turns that I mentioned before, the forensic turn and the spatial turn and so on, these have opened up questions about, first of all, empirical questions about different parts of the Holocaust that we haven't necessarily thought of before, but also theoretical questions. And I think one that's interesting might be, for example, network analysis. So these big data type analyses that show how groups of survivors migrated and who they knew and where they moved to and what assistance they had and what international aid was on offer. These sorts of things are facilitated partly by digital technologies that weren't available 20 years ago, but partly through simply asking new questions that are coming along. So, I mean, there's loads more that could be said, obviously, but it's a very fast-moving field, I think, in a way that it wasn't, I think, when I was a graduate student. So there's a question at the back there.
Yeah, I guess I have a bunch of questions, so I'll just throw them out there. One, I was curious, does the Russian role in at that time factor in anything that's going on now in terms of Ukraine and Russia now? I was curious if there's any similarities. You talked about the camps and the different kinds of camps a little bit. If there's any, do you have any thoughts on what happened in the U.S. with the camps like here in California? And then lastly, just if you have any thoughts on why, if there was much of an impact from this to the international legal system in terms of, like, lots of atrocities continue to happen up until to this day, and what have we learned from that?
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, the first one I mentioned at the start. I think that one of the things, when I wrote my book on the liberation of the camps, it was I wrote a chapter on the camps and the liberations that were carried out by the Red Army. And again, it was a kind of difficult or a sensitive topic to negotiate, because I didn't want to be read as a celebrator of communism. But nevertheless, it is a historical reality that the Red Army did liberate camps and did carry out these trials and so on, and that's extremely important. And when you read the statements of Red Army soldiers, they're no different from the American or British or Canadian soldiers' responses to what they saw on a human level. So those similarities are really are very important. But what's happening today is an inversion of anti-fascist memory. So obviously the Great Patriotic War functioned throughout the duration of the Soviet Union as a kind of social glue to hold the Union together. And I think from the 60s onwards, when the wartime generation started to hand over to the younger generations, the myth of anti-fascism held less power. I mean, that's true across the whole of the Eastern Bloc. But the Great Patriotic War continued to function as the major source of pride in the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet Russia. And it's been instrumentalized very deliberately under Putin, so that you now have this argument that says Russian anti-fascism is the basis on which we need to invade Ukraine, to denazify Kiev. It's clearly nonsense. I mean, there are some Nazis in Ukraine, but there are some Nazis everywhere. So it's not, this argument that Ukraine needed denazifying is, I mean, it's just a simple land grab. So in that sense, but there are people on the far left who still can't get out of this mindset and still sympathize with Putin, and you think, what can't you see like what's happening there? Your second question, you're talking about camps for the internment of Japanese Americans, right? I mean, I some of the literature on that subject talks very clearly about concentration camps, and I understand why, but I don't quite see them as concentration camps. I have to say that, in the sense, again, I'm not trying to minimize what happened to Japanese Americans, but for the most part, these were camps that had, for example, libraries, functioning post offices where people were allowed to visit and so on. And I'm aware of the fact that they were not pleasant. And I think it doesn't matter whether we call them concentration camps or not, to say that this was a terrible indictment of what was supposed to be a liberal democracy. And in the same way that the British interned enemy aliens, most of whom were anti-Nazis, the internment of Japanese Americans, whether they were citizens or not, was a terrible travesty, quite clearly, that this kind of whipped up frenzy. And I noticed in Santa Monica that there was a Dr. Seuss experience, which I sadly haven't had time to visit. But when you look at Dr. Seuss's wartime cartoons about the Japanese, for example, you can see where the cat in the hat came from and so on. But his caricatures of Japanese Americans in those cartoons are really brutal, so although I don't quite see them as sharing the same characteristics of the Nazi camps or the Gulag, let's say, but that doesn't mean that the process of interning them was not an absolute disgrace. And finally, all right, the international legal system. This is obviously a complicated question. That the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Genocide Convention, the whole architecture of post-war human rights emerged out of the end of World War II, the creation of the United Nations, the Atlantic Charter, and so on. And the establishment of the International Criminal Court in The Hague in 1999, which incorporates the preamble to the Genocide Convention into its own preamble, is, I think, an indication, even though there was this 40-year hiatus between Nuremberg and the creation of the ICC, largely, I think, because of the US refusing to sign up to the Genocide Convention, there is nevertheless a very powerful tool of sanction against people who now commit genocide. There is obviously a leftist critique that says it's only ever minor African dictators who are going to stand trial in The Hague. Maybe, but that doesn't necessarily diminish the significance of the universalist thinking that lies behind it. And clearly that international architecture is under some pressure at the moment, let's say. But the principle of it is, I think, an important one.
I have two questions. So, one's about the book and one isn't about the book.
Can you speak up just a
I'm
little
sorry.
bit? There's a microphone.
Okay, so I just have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The one that isn't about the book might not seem immediately relevant, but we're in Los Angeles, we're at USC, Spielberg,
Yeah.
it's involved in the show. I work with I'm a filmmaker.
Okay.
There's a lot of discussing kind of the intersection of modernity with the Holocaust. There's a lot of talk as of late regarding Jonathan Glazer's Oscar speech for the Zone of Interest. And I, as a renowned scholar of the Holocaust, I was just curious for your view. Did you agree with it? Did you think it was appropriate? Maybe those are two different answers. I'm just curious for your take.
I thought what Steven Spielberg said here a couple of weeks ago was measured, in the sense that he said that there's no reason why we shouldn't be shocked at what happened on October the 7th, but also shocked by the Israeli response to it. And I also, I didn't see anything much to object to in what Jonathan Glazer said.
Really?
I thought that his speech was deliberately misread by those who said he wanted to, when he talked about his Jewishness, I don't think he was denying his Jewishness. He was talking about his, I can't remember the exact phrasing now.
I can read the speech.
Please,
if you like,
that little section.
so that it's not misrepresented. So he said, "Our film shows where dehumanization leaves at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many."
Okay, that'll do. Those people. So what he meant by that was we're not refuting our Jewishness. We refute the idea that our Jewishness and the Holocaust should be hijacked. His terminology was unfortunate, I think, and he's probably a better filmmaker than he is a speech writer. But
you said
I
you
think
didn't view anything out.
I didn't see what was exceptional particularly about that. What he's saying there, I think, is that that the consequences of the Israeli occupation and what has happened in Israel,
in the West Bank.
and in Gaza are.
Gaza is only occupied post October 7th, and the military response.
We can argue about that.
Really?
I think that it's okay. No, I mean, what he was basically saying, I think, was again this kind of appeal to a sort of universalist message that if we object to people being persecuted, and then we should object everywhere, not make exceptions for groups of people because we happen to be connected to some.
So as a director of a Holocaust film, the word occupation passed his lips before victims of the Shoah, before Holocaust victims who were killed.
You'd have to ask him about that. I mean, I think that he. I'm obviously not speaking for him or defending him. I read him as simply saying that people who are victimized everywhere deserve our sympathy, and I see nothing objectionable about that.
If I may,
Sure.
about the book, and I'm just genuinely engaging.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I appreciate that you put particular attention on accountability of Eastern European
Mm-hmm.
nations,
Mm-hmm.
particularly contemporary governments in Poland,
Mm-hmm.
Hungary, Belarus,
Mm-hmm.
Romania, etc., and holding them accountable because there's a lot of historical revisionism regarding the Holocaust there. Do you think there's a risk in your theses regarding Shoah isn't synonymous with the camps, that the Holocaust isn't synonymous with Jews and the Germans, and a myriad of other things that you had mentioned? I'd also like to add that the term anti-Semitism was only mentioned twice in your speech in your hour, towards 10 minutes at the end, and we can refer to the tape if you think that's an inaccuracy. Do you think there's a risk in denuding the Holocaust and sort of sensationalizing and upside down everything you know about the Holocaust is wrong to the lay person, not to the scholars who you said was your target demo for this?
No, I don't, not in the slightest. And perhaps I didn't use the term anti-Semitism more than twice, but I think I talked about Jews and the murder of Jews the whole way through my talk.
Is anti-Semitism only the murder of Jews?
Quite clearly not, but I think I'm talking about the context of the Holocaust, where an anti-Semitic ideology did indeed end in the murder of Jews. And so, but my point was, again, in terms of trying to understand and unpack the intentionalist, functionalist sort of position, that anti-Semitism on its own is not an explanation for the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism has existed.
It was a feature of the Holocaust.
Yeah, sure, but it's not an explanation for it. Anti-Semitism exists in many places at different times, and so in order to understand the role played by anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology, also have to understand something about why a particular regime operationalizes and weaponizes that anti-Semitism at particular moments. And there's more to Nazi ideology than simply anti-Semitism. That if you read Mein Kampf, it's a mishmash of all sorts of pretty common ideas in the early 20th century. But the Nazi obsession with the Jews is peculiar and marks the Nazi regime out from other fascist regimes. So there is this total obsession amongst the Nazi leadership, this obsession with the Jews. I don't see how anything I've written in that book could possibly signify to the lay reader that anti-Semitism is not important.
That wasn't my question, but thank you.
Okay.
Hi. So I have a couple of questions from the Zoom, our Zoom audience here. And this actually relates to, I think, the previous, one of the questions you answered previously, from Eric Liesner, research postgraduate from Royal Holloway, University of London.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Asking, I'm interested in the point about fascist memory and far-right groups. Could you please say more about the impact of fascist history not being previously discussed and worked through on the far right?
Well, I mean, people know, and this is also one of the kind of turns, I suppose, that has influenced the writing of the history of the Holocaust, that memory studies is now a kind of massive field in its own right. But that field has been very largely shaped by questions of Holocaust memory and Holocaust representation and so on. Cinema and trials and literature and poetry and art, and memorials and museums and so on. These have all been central to many of the issues that drive memory studies, and particularly the literature on, let's say, Holocaust memorials or museums is enormous, and there's a huge amounts, of case studies and general articles. But memory studies is about trying to understand how. It can do two things. It can ask the question, how is the past represented in the present? Not to ask the question, what is a historically accurate account, but to ask, how is the past represented in a way that shows to us today what is meaningful about the past? And the other way is to ask, and this is, I think, a question that Alain Confino asks, how did memory function in the past? So how did let's say, Germans at the time of the Third Reich think about their own collective memory at that time? So that's a slightly separate issue. But so I think that here, memory studies has often focused on the victims of the Holocaust and the representation of the Holocaust. I simply mentioned in passing that there hasn't been a lot of work done on collective memory in fascist groups, or in the ways in which memory of World War II has been instrumentalized or memorialized in, let's say, far-right circles. There's a certain amount of work done on, again, usually in passing. If you think about Willem Sassen, the Dutch Nazi that interviewed Eichmann in Argentina, there's a certain amount written about him and the circles in which he moved, and the Odessa, and the attempt to spirit Nazis out of Europe at the end of the war, that kind of thing. But there are a few scholars who've written about fascist memory in the sense I mean more narrowly, i.e. how the memory of World War II informs what far-right groups say to themselves now. But it's not very pleasant work. But I think it's important, because if we're trying to understand the rise of the far right, again, in the US and in parts of South America and across Europe and elsewhere, then thinking, methodologically speaking at least, the question, how does collective memory function for fascist groups, is as valid as asking the question, how does collective memory function in terms of thinking about the representation of the Holocaust?
And if we have time for it, I have another question from Adriana Reynoso, an indexer with the Shoah Foundation, who says, thank you for your presentation and Dr. Stone. I'm wondering what you see as the barrier to getting this broader understanding of the Holocaust and its parameters, not synonymous with camps, not just about Germans and groups and collaboration to the public, and not just like within the academic community. Further, what might be a way around that barrier?
Wow.
You're good.
Thank you. What can I say? I mean, there seems to be an appetite for less analytical works on the subject, which I think is regrettable in some ways, sort of myth-making stories that I think is a disservice to the significance of the subject, so that the Holocaust shouldn't be reduced to tales of love stories and such in the death camps. This is a part of history that tells us something about the dangers of ideology, about the capabilities of the modern state, and about racism and anti-Semitism. And those are things that should not be reduced to rom-coms. So I'm trying. What can I say?
Well, thank you very much. Doing more than trying. I'll just say that.